Hello, Mishpacha. It's Courtney, America's Jewish mother, and I am here today to film my Friday Reads video. In the last week, I finished 3 books, and I am currently reading 2 books, and I want to talk to you about them. So the first book I finished was the Tallulah Bankhead autobiography that I've been reading for a little while now. This ended up getting 3 stars from me, which basically means that I recommend it with some reservations and conditions. Now, I enjoyed this, but I think it's definitely not a book for everyone. So, first of all, it's a little all over the place. I mean, in terms of being a memoir, it basically does go sequentially from her childhood days through the course of her career, but I think this really could have used some editing because she kind of jumps around a lot and goes off on tangents, and then definitely toward the end of it, she went off on some tangents that I didn't think necessarily went in sequential order, and I wasn't really sure why they were there. The other thing about this book is that part of the reason why I wanted to read this is because I have a sort of weakness for strong female characters who are larger than life. And I will say that Tallulah Bankhead definitely bought into the myth of her own legend. So you definitely kind of get a sense of that as you read through this. It's definitely written by her. I do not think this was ghostwritten. It seems like stuff that she would say. So I liked that about it, but I think that someone who, you know, basically like knows that they're hot stuff and thinks that they're hot stuff, right, is not going to be everyone's cup of tea. Again, I liked it because I personally have a weakness for that, but I realize why some people might not. The book also gives you a number of very nice photographs throughout at various points of her life, so that was cool. And something about this particular copy of the book is that apparently this once excuse me, belonged to an army library in Fort Kobe or Cobb, K-O-B-B-E, in the Panama Canal Zone. And I'm going to insert a clip here where I show you the stamp of that in the book. Okay, so this is the mark of the former library in Fort Cobb or Kobe in the Panama Canal Zone, where this used to live before it made its way back to the States. And I think the reason why this used to belong to an army library in the Panama Canal Zone is because at one point Tallulah Bankhead mentions that she made a movie that was set in the Canal Zone. So I think that's why it ended up there. So this particular book once was there, and I looked up some information on that particular post, and it mostly closed down in the 80s, and so at some point after that it must have made its way back to the United States and was bought by Gainesville College, which was formerly a separate entity before Georgia, excuse me, before the state of Georgia started consolidating schools, and this became part of the University of North Georgia's library. So I thought that was cool, just about the history of this one particular book. So yeah, so I think if you are familiar with Tallulah Bankhead's work and you want to read more about her, or if you want to kind of know about what it was like being in specifically the theater and in early motion pictures, this would be a good book to read. Oh, the other thing I forgot to mention about this that I didn't really love was that she, and I think could have used an editor, is that she does a lot of name dropping and makes a lot of references, and I was familiar with a lot of the names that she mentioned, but not all of them. And so again, that's really where some more editing would have come in handy to let me know whether these people were actually important and I should remember them, or whether they were just gonna like come up in one place and I was never gonna hear about them again. And also just to give me some more context. I mean, you know, obviously again, I knew who some people were, like David O. Selznick or John and Ethel Barrymore, right? Like I know who those people are, but then, you know, like I said, some other people she mentioned, and you know, if you're not somebody who's familiar with the world of theater or Hollywood in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, you know, then you're not going to get some of the references that she makes and just expects you to understand. So 3 stars. If you know Tallulah Bankhead from her work and want to know more about her, I think this is a good place to learn more. I will say, though, that it seemed very clear to me based on her tone throughout that she badly wants you to like her and root for her. So it's not quite a tell-all book, even though there is one chapter, and I think I mentioned this in my last Friday Reads video, where she is pretty candid about her use of alcohol and various drugs. But again, she sort of frames it in a way that although she has been a drinker at various stages in her life, that the drugs were just sort of, you know, accidents that happened and they were offered to her and she felt like she had to take them, you know. So yeah, that also, I think, made this book a little less revealing than you would perhaps like a memoir autobiography to be. She's also not always super forthcoming about how relationships of hers ended. But I think the one thing that I appreciate about this is that she does seem to have a good sense of self-awareness. So yeah, so that's Tallulah, my autobiography, 3 stars. The next book I finished was Jack Gilbert's Refusing Heaven. This is a short little collection of poetry. This was a reread for me. I read this once in a poetry graduate seminar, and I liked it. I remember liking it. And so I just, you know, one of my reading goals last year was to read more poetry, and so I'm kind of continuing that through this year. So just figured I'd pick it back up and see if I still liked it. And I did. So I ended up giving this 4 stars. So in this collection, Gilbert focuses a lot on age, memory, past relationships. A lot of the poems meditate on 3 previous relationships he's had with women throughout his life. There are poems about his time in Italy. I think he lived for at least several years in Italy during the course of one of his relationships. And he just sort of asks questions like, you know, when we love someone and the relationship comes to an end, does that signify some type of failure, or should we think about it as signifying some kind of failure or some kind of ending? And I want to read you one poem from this collection that is my favorite, and it's actually the second poem in here. It's short, by the way. It's called Naked Except for the Jewelry. And, she said, you must talk no more about ecstasy. It is a loneliness. The woman wandered about, picking up her shoes and silks. You said you loved me, the man said. We tell lies, she said, brushing her wonderful hair, naked except for the jewelry. We try to believe. You were helpless with joy, he said, moaning and weeping. In the dream, she said, we pretend to ourselves that we are touching. The heart lies to itself because it must. So, if you liked that poem, I think that's a fairly accurate reflection of a lot of the poems in this collection, although I will say most of them do not have dialogue in them. But in terms of that theme of love and are we lying to ourselves about things, and what is the point of relationships and affairs and things like that, and just sort of reflections on past love life. That's all in here, so I ended up giving this 4 stars. The next book I finished was Nina Simone's autobiography, so this was just a week of memoirs for me. So, memoir and a little poetry. So this is I Put a Spell on You, the autobiography of Nina Simone. So I mentioned this in my May TBR, but Nina Simone, if you've never heard of her, was a fairly well-known protest singer during the civil rights movement of the 1950s, 60s, 70s. And she was pretty well known for jazz and folk kind of music. So yeah, it was interesting to hear her sort of recount the story of her own life. She was actually born in my home state of North Carolina, and her family was quite large, and she was a piano prodigy at a very young age. She started playing piano in church when she was, I think like 4 or something, which is insane. And then they saw that she had this talent, and they sent her to a teacher who helped sort of nurture her talent. And originally she wanted to become the first black classical concert pianist, and that remained her dream even through her early days of singing in clubs and things like that. She was kind of thinking, well, this is just a thing I'm going to do for a while to make money, so then I can, you know, go to Juilliard and pursue my real dream. But yeah, so she ended up becoming an international superstar. And I've actually found this memoir a lot more candid in some ways than the Tallulah Bankhead autobiography. I think Nina Simone never really buys into the idea that she's a star. She seems very sort of humble throughout most of her career, and I did feel like she was pretty forthcoming in terms of talking about her relationships with people. The only places where I felt like she might have held back a little bit were in her relationship with her husband Andy, who was the father of her daughter Lisa, and I also felt like she might have held back some talking about the relationship with her daughter, because I saw a documentary about her called something like What Happened, Miss Simone, a few years ago, and the daughter is interviewed in that, and based on what Lisa said in that interview, it seemed like Andy, her father, was pretty abusive throughout the length of their marriage. But Nina Simone only talks about one incident of domestic abuse that happened when they were engaged, and she doesn't mention anything else about subsequent abuse, and so I felt like those two things really didn't add up. And then the other thing is that again, based on that documentary I saw a number of years ago, it seemed like Lisa had some really sort of conflicting feelings about her mother, and Nina Simone, pardon me, does actually say in here that she felt like her relationship with her daughter was pretty strained because she was unable to kind of be there for her as much as she would have liked to have been when she was a child, because she had to tour all the time and was on the road constantly. But she's not too reflective about that, and I would have liked to have seen more reflectiveness from her on those relationships, because it also seemed to me from this book that Nina Simone spent a lot of her life waiting for a man to step in and save her, and she didn't really have an aha moment that she needed to save herself until, gosh, I don't know, sometime in the late 80s. And so there's really only one chapter, because this book was published in 1991, there's really only one chapter where she sort of has that revelation and then does something about it. So again, I would have liked to sort of seen more reflectiveness about all of the time previously in her life that she spent like waiting for a man to save her, and see that she sort of learned something from that. But again, that was sort of missing. But otherwise, I thought this was very good. It was super informative. It was also sort of a more accurate picture of a memoir autobiography than the Tallulah Bankhead one. Like, it starts in her childhood. It chronologically goes until basically like the late 80s, but right before this book was published. So, and there are also pictures that are included in this one too that were cool. So I ended up giving this 4 stars. I would recommend it if you are interested in Nina Simone and her life and work, or if you're just interested in the civil rights movement and you want to know more about what that looked like from the point of view of someone who was an artist during that time period. This book is also very informative on that. So those are the 3 books I finished. The 2 books I'm currently reading are, I'm still reading Richard Wright's Native Son with Lindsay. Excuse me. We're about 340 pages into this, so we're into part 3. We think have like 2 more check-ins for our buddy read, and then we'll be done with the book. Y'all, this book has been a ride. In fact, I said to Lindsay in my last Voxer message to her that I think Richard Wright was just, when he wrote this book, he was like, what is the craziest thing I can come up with? And then I'm gonna write that in here. And I think he just sort of kept trying to top himself. Because yeah, this book just gets wilder and wilder. So yeah, that's all I'm gonna say about that. Oh, the other thing I'll say about it is that this really hit me while I was reading the Tallulah Bankhead autobiography, because she writes that in a way that feels very dated. And it feels like it was written by someone who was raised in the 1920s and 30s. And this book does not. This book was published in 1940, and it reads very much like a contemporary novel that could have been written, you know, within the past few years. Maybe minus all of the references to communism. But other than that, that's really the only thing about it that feels dated to me. So I thought that was an interesting sort of distinction between the two of them. So if you're worried about reading books that are older because you think they're not going to feel, you know, fresh or contemporary, this is not a problem with Native Son. The other book I'm currently reading is Thomas Hardy's The Mayor of Casterbridge. And y'all, this book has really grabbed me because I started reading it on Wednesday, and before I went to bed last night, I was already on page 280. So I have been gulping this book down as fast as I can. There's a lot that happens. So The Mayor of Casterbridge is about a man named Michael Henchard, and at the beginning of the novel, so this is not a spoiler, and it's also in the description of this book on the Goodreads page, so I'm not giving anything away. So at the beginning of the book, he and his wife and their young daughter, who's, you know, maybe 2 or younger than that, go to this, travel to this fair, and he's a hay trusser, I don't really know what that means, but anyway, he's looking for work. And so they stop at this fair, and while they're there, he gets kind of drunk, and then he starts basically kind of saying about how if only he didn't have this wife, you know, weighing him down, he could get rich and be a really important man and stuff like that. And his wife is right there while he's saying all of this, and you're just like, this is very uncomfortable. And the wife is basically like, you know, Michael, stop, you know, you've said this before, and, you know, you're taking this too far. And he's like, no, I'm serious. I wish someone would, you know, would buy this woman, you know, and take her away from me so I didn't have to deal with her, right? So he keeps sort of like on, and eventually, like, he sells his wife to a sailor for 5 guineas. So, oh my God, right? And she's like, well, I'm taking the kid with me. So then she leaves. So the other thing is that she actually agrees to it. And the sailor who buys her says, well, you know, I'm not going to take her if she doesn't want to go with me. And she's like, nope, I'm going with you. I don't like this guy anymore. So she leaves with the sailor, takes off her wedding ring and throws it at Michael before she leaves. And then he proceeds to fall asleep in a drunken stupor. And then when he wakes up in the morning, he's kind of like, what happened last night? And then he sees the ring, and he's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I did that, and I can't believe she really went. So after that, he takes a vow that he's not, at this point he's 20 years old, he takes a vow that he is not going to touch any drop of alcohol for at least another 20 years. And then it cuts to sometime, you know, later, many years later, his original wife and child are traveling around looking for him. Now, the daughter doesn't know anything about the selling of her mother and herself when she was a young girl. She just grew up believing that the sailor who the wife Susan went off with was her father. So she doesn't know anything about this. So all she knows from her mother is that her mother said that they're looking for Michael Henchard because the sailor who she thinks of as her father has now died, and they're pretty poorly off financially speaking, and so they're trying to find Michael Henchard to see. So, well, Susan's not really hoping for a reconciliation or anything. She's just kind of like, I need some form of money or something. So anyway, so she tracks him down. It turns out that he's living in Casterbridge, and he has in fact worked himself up to become a very prominent citizen of Casterbridge. And in fact, he is the mayor, and he is very financially well off at this point. So So then, they go there, and it's this whole question of, oh my gosh, are they going to, or is Susan going to confront him? Is Elizabeth Jane, the daughter, going to find out about everything that happens? And y'all, this book is just so dramatic, and I love it. There's deathbed confessions. There's characters swooping back in later in the book to throw bombshells down. I mean, this is the stuff that I live for. Live for this kind of drama. So the storyline is quite compelling to me. I will say about this book, though, that Thomas Hardy does a lot of scene setting. So even though there's all this stuff that I just talked about that happens, it happens in between long, drawn-out descriptions of buildings and nature and the tent that they're in and what the woman selling this drink looks like and stuff like that. So I think Thomas Hardy really likes to do scene setting more than he likes to do plotting and dialogue. So if you can put up with that, I think it's worth it. It did take me a little bit of time to kind of get back in the groove of that, because I haven't read Thomas Hardy since whenever the last time was I read Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which has been a good number of years ago now. So that did take a bit of getting used to, but again, the storyline I found so compelling that, again, I literally read 280 pages of this in 2 days. So yes, that's how that's going. So those are the books I've been reading this week, or that I finished this week. If any of those are of interest to you, or if you've read them, please feel free to drop a comment down below. Please also feel free to tell me what you've been reading this week. I hope everyone is staying healthy and well. I hope you're getting good reading done, whatever you're reading. And until next time, would it kill you to call you mother?